right. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining week 2 of our Introduction to Watercolor series with Ruth Guerry. She's the Creative Engagement Manager for Mather Community Initiatives. She's an art therapist and practicing artist, and she weaves her personal experience as an herbalist, meditator, and maker into programs that focus on whole person wellness. In this session, we'll be discovering basic watercolor techniques and the mindfulness benefits of mark making and working with watercolors. And with that, I will pass the floor to Ruth.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nicole. And hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here with you all today. This is our second session of Intro to Watercolor. But if you didn't join us last week, know that that's completely okay. You can hop on now and still like connect and find hopefully helpful information. Last week, we just spent time kind of going over some of the basic watercolor supplies and different ways that we can use some of those supplies. There was a handout that focused on some of the different supplies that are out there, but please know that you don't have to use those supplies. Whatever supplies you have will work. I'll be demoing with a variety of supplies just so you can see that whatever you have, you can create a really nice watercolor with it. So, like I said, last week we talked about supplies. Today we're actually going to start with some painting. We're going to cover some of the watercolor basics. So we're going to spend some time kind of going over our palette, blending and mixing color. We'll talk a little bit about the color wheel. And if we have time, we'll kind of jump into some different techniques. We're going to kind of take our time with it today, though. I think it's important to kind of spend some time really building that foundation so we're able to paint successfully. But with everything that we talk about today and in this series, know that we're going to go over a variety of tips and tricks and helpful watercolor techniques. You can use all of them and have a very successful painting, but you can also ignore all of them and still have a very successful painting. So take what's helpful and know that it is completely okay to ignore the rest. So let's jump in. I'm going to show, if we could go to my hands really quickly, we'll talk a little bit about the supplies that we need for today. So these are, let me pull up a little bit. There we go. These are our basic supplies. Now you can bring other watercolor supplies in, but these are the basic things that we need. First, our pigment. Now you can use a pan palette like I have here that already has the colors in it. That works perfectly. I got this one at a dollar store and works very well. Or you can use a palette that you created yourself by adding tube watercolor in. Either one works well. I'll be demoing with both. So we'll need our pigment. We'll also need our paintbrush. Now I've got two brushes here. This is a small round brush and a small flat brush. These are probably the most versatile brushes. They are ones that come in a palette. So when you get a pan palette, you'll either get a round brush or a flat brush. Either of them will work. You can also use brushes that you brought in yourself, that you bought separately. Again, I'm using a round brush and a flat brush. There are a lot of brushes out there. They are used for different purposes, but the truth is, whatever brush feels better in your hand is good. You can do a lot of things with just one brush. If you have a variety of brushes with you and you want to know which one to start with, I definitely recommend doing a round brush. It's the most versatile, and you'll see that's what I spend most of the time using. But a round brush or a flat brush or both are really good to start. The next thing we need after our pigment and our brushes is going to be our paper. Now I'm going to be using watercolor paper today. Watercolor paper is ideal for watercolor because it's nice and thick. Because we're using water, we need a sturdy paper. So the heavier the paper, the thicker the paper, the better it will hold up with water. So watercolor paper is ideal. Mixed media paper also works. The thicker the paper, the better, right? But you can also bring in other type of paper too and kind of experiment with how watercolor interacts with that. I'll be using that watercolor paper today. And then the last set of supplies that we need are going to be our 2 cups of water and a rag or paper towel. We're using 2 cups of water. One is to clean our brush, and the other is to add clean water to our palette, to our painting. It's always helpful to have two because you'll notice as you're painting that the cup of water that you're using to clean your brush will start to get muddy or discolored. And it's nice to use clean water when we're adding it to our palette. So those 2 water cups are going to be helpful. Now, to start off, every palette is different. If you even get the same colors, like if you get a Viridian green from different brands, different companies, that Viridian green will be similar, but it'll be slightly different when you start painting with it. It's helpful to create a color swatch of each palette that you have. So we're going to talk about some color swatches to start off. Color swatches are important for your different palettes because colors look different when they're wet than when they're dry. And so it's helpful to have a color swatch for each of your palettes just so you can see which colors are which. I'll show an example here. This is a color swatch that I did earlier. And you can see that I've labeled the different colors and I've used my pan palette here. What you'll notice is first off, my true blue that I have here looks very blue, but when I look in my palette, it looks incredibly dark. And that's part of the reason why it's really helpful to have a color swatch for each of your palettes. So when you're mixing colors, when you're building a painting a piece, you can see what color you're actually going to get rather than what color is here on the palette, if that makes sense. So we're going to kind of walk through to start. We're going to kind of walk through making a color swatch for our palette. So whether you're using a pan palette or a palette that you've made, you've assembled yourself, having that color swatch is helpful. Now, what I'm going to do to start off is tape down my paper. This is not something that you have to do, but it's something that is helpful. The reason it's helpful is 2 reasons. One, it tapes it down so it doesn't move on you while you're painting. And the second reason is that sometimes when we're adding a lot of water, our paper can ripple a little bit. And so when we tape it down, it has a way of keeping it kind of straight and still. So I'm just taking some painter tape and taping down my paper. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? We're just going to be practicing with our paint today. If you have your watercolor paint and your paper and your water, your brushes, if you have that with you, I definitely want to invite you to follow along. Or you're welcome to just kind of watch and take notes and try out later. But it's helpful to tape that paper down. Now, if you don't have painter's tape, know that that's okay. You can use a masking tape. It's a little stickier than painter's tape. It's not meant for being used with paint. So if you are using masking tape, one of my suggestions is to touch it to your clothes before you put it on the paper, and that'll help it come off a little bit, a little easier. So our next step, after we kind of tape down our paper, and feel free to take your time with the taping down, I'm just going to set up my space. This is important when you're creating a painting because you want to have stuff laid out that's easy to get to. So the main thing I'm setting up is my watercolor palettes are right here. Like I said, whatever palette you have is going to work well. I'm going to be demoing with both of them. But I've also got my 2 cups of water and my rag or paper towel, and then I've got my brushes handy. I want to lay everything out in a way that's easy to kind of get to. Now, before we start our first kind of step into painting, one of the things I also want to point out that I wasn't able to mention last week is that you'll notice this is a palette that I built myself. I added my colors together. Added what colors I wanted. But what I did is on the back of my palette, I put a piece of tape down and wrote down the color names that I used. And the reason for that is when we look at our palette here, you'll see I've got 3 different blues in my palette. When I'm running low on a certain blue, I'll need to add more to my palette, but sometimes it's hard for me to tell the difference of which blue is which blue. So that's helpful to come over to the back and see that, oh, the phthalo blue is the one that I'm running low on. And then it helps me know which paint to add to which space, right? So if you are building your own palette, this is really helpful. Either writing it on a piece of tape and putting it on there or writing on the palette itself, it is really helpful, right? Okay. So once we have our space laid out, that very first step is to activate our pigment. Now, the reason we activate our pigment is you'll notice if you touch your paint, nothing comes off, right? It's just a dry palette. A watercolor needs water. So if you just take your wet brush and put it on the watercolor, you get like a pale version of that color. So we activate our watercolor to let that water sit with that pigment and kind of loosen it up. So you get a bolder, more bright, I guess, color. So to activate your watercolor, we just add a little water to it. So you can use a tiny little spray bottle like I have here, and just kind of spray over our palette. You can use a brush. So if you have a paintbrush, you can dip it in the water and then add it to your pigment. Or if you have a dropper, you can just drop a little water on there. You don't need a whole lot, but we want just enough water to kind of cover it. We want it to sit for just a minute and kind of loosen that pigment up. So what I'm going to do is just take my little spray bottle and I'm just going to add a little water, just spraying it. So if you've got your watercolor tray with you, go ahead and activate your watercolors too. This will be the first step every week. Once we lay out our space, we'll activate our watercolors. We'll talk just a moment while that's sitting, and then we'll start our painting process. Right. So while our colors are kind of sitting there, I want to talk just a minute again about those color swatches. So when we create our palette, when we get our paint palette, we want to do those color swatches so we know, again, what it looks like wet versus dry, because they look different, right? We see that my navy blue here, my dark blue, is actually a true blue once you use it as paint. And so that's why having that color swatch is helpful, right? We also use color swatches when we're painting because we're mixing and blending colors. So as you're doing a full painting, it's helpful to have a color swatch so you can match colors, especially when we're mixing. And we're going to spend some time today doing some blending and mixing, talking about some of those different techniques. But if I'm doing a watercolor of a landscape, I'm going to be using some different shades of greens and browns and blues. So I may not have a whole bunch of those colors here. I'm going to mix colors together to get a darker green, a lighter green, different shades of green. So I'm going to be using my palette quite a bit. We have a color swatch to go with our painting so we can kind of match those colors as we're doing painting. So your color swatch can be separate or it can be part of your painting. I usually make it on the same paper. So instead of taping all 4 sides down, I'll tape 3 sides down and then leave a gap and use the side of my paper as my color swatch. We want to make sure that when we're doing a painting, that color swatch is on the same paper that we're doing our painting on. And that's because paper, different brands are kind of different tints. So this paper is more white. If I bring in this one, I don't know if you can see, it's a slight difference in color, right? This one is a little more off-white. And so it's important to do my color swatch. If I'm doing my landscape here, I want to do my color swatch on the same paper, whether it's attached to it or I tape it down. And again, that's so we can match colors. If we're doing mixing and blending, we want to be able to match that color if we have to come back to our watercolor. Watercolor painting is a long process, a slow process. It doesn't take, like, it's not quick. We're literally waiting for water to dry. So sometimes it takes days to work on a watercolor painting. And so when we come back, we want to be able to match those colors and use those same colors. So we're going to talk more about matching colors in a couple sessions, but today we're going to spend some time creating a color swatch and talking about mixing and blending. Right? So mixing and blending. There are about 3 different ways to mix color. You can mix color on your palette, you can mix color on your paper, and you can mix color by layering. right? And we're going to go through all of those ways and just kind of talk about the different benefits, the pros and cons of each type of mixing process. You will find that you don't just stick with one like process. You'll find for different things that you're painting, it requires those different forms of blending. Now, it's not important that we know the titles. Just knowing that there are options out there is helpful. Right. So in order to mix our watercolors, to create a range of colors, we need to have a basic understanding of color theory. Now, this is not a lecture. We're going to actually do some painting. You may already know about a color wheel, right? That's something we learn as a kid. I think it's helpful to kind of take a moment to refresh that knowledge while talking about our watercolor basics. So this is a handout, and I think we put that in the chat a couple of times too, but it's a basic color wheel here. And it's got some basic information that we're going to kind of walk through together before we start that painting. And so I'm going to use my lovely pointer here. And let's go to our color wheel. Using the color wheel is really, really helpful when it comes to mixing and blending. And we'll see examples of that as we go throughout this series for sure. But to start off, we want to kind of focus on primary colors. Now, you may remember primary colors are going to be red, blue, and yellow. These are primary colors because no color mixing can make those colors. They're the pure colors, right? So those are our primary colors. Our secondary colors are going to be the colors that we make from our primary colors. So by using equal part red and an equal part yellow, I can get orange, and that's my secondary color. So by mixing equal parts of our primary colors, we get the secondary colors of orange, green, and violet or purple. Right? And like I said, those secondary colors are made by mixing equal parts of your primary colors. Now, our tertiary colors are going to be these other in-between colors. So they're the colors that are in between our primary colors and our secondary colors. These tertiary colors are made from equal parts of one primary and with equal parts of one secondary. So 1 part red to 1 part orange will give you that red-orange, right? 1 part orange to 1 part yellow will give you that yellow-orange. So by mixing equal parts of one secondary and one primary color, we get that tertiary color. Now we're going to be making a color wheel while we're doing some blending and mixing to really kind of understand how that works. We can kind of talk and watch videos all day, but actually getting in there and doing it just provides a better understanding. So if you have your paints with you, I want to encourage following along with that. So we're going to talk, that was the primary color, our secondary color, and our tertiary color. Just to kind of go through a little bit of that color wheel, we have warm colors and we have cool colors. This is important to think about when we're actually doing our painting. The warm colors are going to be those reds, yellows, oranges. Those cool colors are going to be more of those purple, blues, and greens, right? And so you can see like the warmer colors are clearly like things related to warmer weather, fire, those things. Cooler colors are going to be colder weather. Anyway, that makes sense. Warmer colors, cooler colors. And then complementary colors are the thing we're going to kind of focus on a little bit today. Complementary colors are the colors that are opposite each other on the color wheel. So red's complementary color opposite is green. So red and green are complementary colors. Blue's complementary color is opposite on the color wheel, so that's orange. Blue and orange are the complementary colors of each. Now, we call them complementary colors because those complementary colors are, they make each other brighter, more bold, right? So when we use blue and orange, they make each other kind of vibrate a little bit. The best example of complementary color usage is by Van Gogh, Vincent van Gogh. A lot of his paintings used complementary colors. And we can see that when we look at his paintings, we can see those colors are very bold. And it's because he used that rule of complementary colors, making those colors stand out more. Another reason to know those complementary colors is that when we're creating something that is more of a natural shadow, it's a blending of complementary colors. So if I'm doing an orange, like I'm creating the orange fruit, if I want to create a natural shadow for that orange color, I'm going to add blue to it, and it's going to give me a more natural shadow by mixing that blue and the orange. And we're going to kind of go through that together too. But those are some of the main things to know about that color wheel. So this chart will be kind of handy to reference back and forth, right? Now, when I say like equal parts color, I just mean like if you're using like one brush dip of red, you're using one brush dip of yellow to create that orange. And we'll kind of see that in play here. So I'm going to set this aside for just a moment. And let's go ahead and pull out a piece of paper. Our watercolors have been kind of sitting in that water a little bit, so they're ready to go. I'm going to use just a round brush to start, but I want to encourage us to start off by thinking about color swatches. Now, some of the basics when it comes to using your watercolor brush, and I'm going to move my water back here so you can see what I'm doing. But watercolor brush, we need to have a wet brush, right? So that wet brush, when we dip it in water, it's going to help pick up that pigment. Even though that water is there and it's kind of activating that pigment, we need that wet brush to really transfer that pigment to our paper. Now, when we talk about techniques, we'll talk about different ways to prep your paper for the mark making. But today, if you haven't done watercolor, anything with watercolor before, this is kind of that good first step, thinking about those color swatches. So what I want to invite us to do is to get out your palette and get out your activated palette and your brush. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and dip my brush in the water. I'm going to get my brush nice and wet, and I'm going to go down my palette here. So I'm going to start off with my pan palette. If you have your palette, go ahead. I'm going to dip it in that first color, and I'm just going to kind of move it around, right? So you can see as I'm moving it around, right, it's picking up some pigment, right? It's not a whole lot, right? It's not like using something like acrylic paint where it's got a lot of body to it. It's just tinting my brush a little bit. So my wet brush, wet pigment, I'm going to go to my dry paper here and just make a mark. All right. I'm building a color swatch for my palette here. Right? So once I do my red, I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to kind of swish it around in my water cup. Now you'll notice I used my second water cup. I'm tapping my brush to make sure I have no pigment on it. So I've got my one brush or my 1 cup of clean water, and that's what I'm going to use to dip my brush before I go to my palette. When I'm going to change colors, I'm going to go to my my cleaning brush or water and just kind of swish that around, tap it, and then tap it on my paper towel. This is kind of a good habit to get into. And once we kind of develop that habit of cleaning our brush with one and tapping, and then when we go into get a new color, dipping it in the clean water. Now you'll see me tap a lot. And the reason I tap is so I can kind of keep an eye on how much water I'm putting in my brush. And this is going to come into play later on too. But like I said, it's good to kind of get in that habit too of just kind of tapping. So I've got my first color here. Now, if you're using a palette that you made yourself, it'll come with the names. You'll know that, oh, this red is vermilion. This red is a crimson. This red is medium red. You'll be able to write that down. If you're doing a pan palette here, where it's already added in, what I'm going to do is kind of make up my own names, but I'm going to line up my palette the same way so I can see what colors are what. So I have my red here. So I'm just going to call this one red, just kind of write it down. So I'm labeling my color. Next, I'm going to go and add my next color. And I'm just going to kind of keep it in the same order here across, creating that color swatch. So when I go to reference my paper, I'll know exactly where it is. This isn't as important, the placement with your pan palette, as it is with the palette that you create. But it is good to kind of keep them in order so you can see which color corresponds to which color on the palette, right? So now I'm going to dip my brush in water, just give it a little tap and come over, and I'm going to use my orange here. And again, it's just kind of swooshing that brush around in that palette, picking up some of that pigment. got a little bit on there, tinting it a little bit. And I'm going to come over here and just kind of make that orange. Do a little swatch of that orange. Cleaning my brush, giving it a tap, and just making sure I don't have any color on my brush. So that's my orange. I'm just going to write that down. So we've kind of finished that out, doing those color swatches. You may get to a place like this in your pan palette, if you have a pan palette, where you have two different shades of the same color. So here I've got two different shades of green. I also have two different shades of blue. So if you have your palette where you're putting the tubes in, you know your color names. But here, what I'm going to do is call one green and one dark green, one blue and dark blue. So that'll kind of keep my palette straight, right? So again, dipping it in my water, I'm going to kind of rub it around, swish it around in my pigment till I've got some pigment on my brush, and then just come add a little mark. Tap it, and then tap it on my paper, and just kind of continue on. Swish it around, and each of those color pigments, you can see it tinting. You can see the different colors here. And so you can see already in just these four colors that I've done, how it tints the water when I clean my brush. And so I want to make sure that I'm not putting the tinted water in my palette because that will change the color of my pigment, right? So that's one reason why it's helpful to have those two cups. And then as you're doing your color swatches, you can call them green and dark green, or whatever you like to name it. But again, doing those color swatches is really helpful. If you're wanting to go ahead and finish your palette today, definitely continue on putting those color swatches. I'm going to do just a couple more so we can kind of get into that rhythm of tapping, right? Going to our color, our pigment here, moving that brush around till we've got a little pigment on our brush, and then coming and just kind of doing those little swatches. And again, what you'll notice is while they're wet, they look like one color, but then they'll dry a little differently. So some pigments, depending on the brands, some pigments will dry darker, and some pigments will dry lighter. And that's again why it's helpful to have those color swatches so you can see what that dried color will look like. And so then we can just kind of continue on. What I've done is I have a little card. I cut mine out after I made it, and that's what I keep with my palette here. You can do that with your, if you have a bigger palette like I do here, you can still do that here with your colors as well. Okay. And it's just helpful to kind of have that. So again, you can see what the true color is. You'll notice the dark green here looks very different from the dark green in my palette. And so that color swatch is really important. So if you want to continue doing those color swatches, definitely do that, or you can pause that and come back to it a little later. But I want to talk about mixing and blending colors. So I'm going to save a space here to kind of finish out my color swatches. And I want to spend just a moment talking about creating a color wheel. Okay. So I've got this example of a color wheel here, and it's very similar to how this one is laid out on our handout. So we're just going to kind of go through and to talk about mixing and blending, we're going to do that as we build our color wheel. Okay. So to start off, I'm going to pull out an extra palette here. Now, for mixing and blending, there are, like I said, three different ways to do that. You'll need a palette, and if you have like your pan palette or your palette that you've added color to, it comes with little squares here that you can mix color with. You can also use, this is a palette that I got from the dollar store. I like this one because then I have these deeper surfaces that hold paint for me. But there's no, like, not one that's better than the other. So to start off, whichever palette you're using is good. But what we're going to do is let's go ahead and paint our primary colors. So I'm going to get my brush again, dip it in the water, do a little tap, and I'm going to come to my basic red. So whether you've got the pan palette or a palette you made, pick out what your true red is going to be. So I'm going to do this one right here. dip my brush in it where I've got a little bit of that red color there. And I'm going to kind of lay my palette out the same way it is in this example here, starting by creating just kind of a red color swatch, right? I'm going to remember that this is my color, my true red, right? So my true red that I'm using. Let's come over and do our yellow. So I'm going to dip my brush in the water, do a little tap, come to my yellow, dip it in. So I've got a little bit of yellow here. I'm going to add that yellow to my color wheel, right? Clean my brush, tap it on my rag. Still got a little color coming off. There we go. And then I'm going to do my true blue. So dip it in a little red, tap it. I'm going to do my true blue here. And then come over here to my wheel and add that color. So these are my basic colors, my primary colors, right? These are the colors. If you only have 3 colors in your palette, these are the 3 you want because you can mix all sorts of colors from these basic 3, right? So if you're following along, go ahead and do a red, a yellow, and a blue mark. Now, to make our secondary colors, this is where some mixing is going to happen. Now, you can mix colors in 3 different ways, and we're going to kind of go through that as we're mixing colors here. So to mix our red and our yellow, we're going to make orange, right? That's our secondary color. So one way to mix is by mixing in a palette, right? So to mix in a palette, one easy way to start is to take your brush, dip it in water, and put that on your palette. I'm just going to do a couple dips here. So you can do it on your palette if it's separate or on your paint palette. Either one is good. Then I'm going to start off by mixing my colors, right? I'm going to add my colors to it. So I've got yellow and red. Yellow is my lightest color, so I'm going to start with that. I'm going to dip my brush in the water, give it a tap, come over to my yellow here. Just going to kind of get a good amount on my brush. We're doing 1 part yellow to 1 part red. So I'm going to go over to my water here and just kind of scrape my brush on the side of that hole. We can do that on our regular paint palette too, just by scraping it on the side, right? That gets that pigment off our brush. So now I'm going to come over to my water cup, clean my brush, tap it to make sure I don't have any yellow on it, go to my clean cup, get some water on it, tap it, and then come to my red here, right? So this is my true red that I'm using, this color here. So I'm going to go over to my palette again and just kind of scrape. I scraped it 3 times, just like I did with my yellow. We're doing equal parts, so we want to do the somewhat similar amount. Right? So once I clean my brush, I have the equal parts of yellow, the equal parts of red. I'm just going to mix it. So now I've got this orange color that's a mix between that yellow and red. So what I'm going to do is just kind of take it and do my orange mark here. Okay, so that orange is a mix of that red and yellow. So let's continue on. I'm going to clean my brush again, tap it. And what I'm going to use, I'm going to come back to this orange, right? So I'm going to leave that there. I'm not going to clean it up. I'm going to leave that orange there because we're going to use that orange to create our tertiary colors, right? So I'm going to come over to my next one here on yellow and blue, right? So if we mix our yellow and blue, we get that secondary color of green, right? So to mix that color and get that green, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to go over, get clean water, and I'm just going to do a couple drops of that clean water, right? And then come over, get my yellow. It's my lightest color, so it's always good to start with that lightest color. Get that yellow on my brush, and then do those little scrapes, right? 1, 2. You don't have to do 3. I'm just doing 3 to help me remember how many brush scrapes I'm doing. Once you get that color there, we're going to clean it and just tap it. There we go. Right. So then we'll go to our clean water, tap. I'm going to go to that blue, my true blue, and do the same thing. Get the blue on my brush and then come over here and do that scrape. 1, 2, 3. Right. Clean my brush. Right. And then I'm going to come back. I'm not putting more water when I'm doing the mixing because I'm not wanting to thin out that color, but I'm just kind of tapping it dry, mostly dry, and then mixing that in. And you can see it's building that green color. It's the green that's in between the yellow and blue. So what I'm going to do is just take that green with my brush and kind of add that green there. So we built that second, painted that second dairy color. Right? And then we'll do the same with that red and blue, right? With red and blue, it's hard sometimes to know which one is brighter. Blue is generally really dark just across the board. So it's always good if you're mixing something with blue, use that other color first. So we'll use that red first. And we're going to mix the same way, mixing in a palette. Now, if you mix in a palette, one of the benefits to that is that if that dries, what I can do, like let's say I want to come back tomorrow and use that same shade of orange, I'll leave this palette, the mixed color. It'll dry. When I come back tomorrow, all I have to do is rehydrate it, activate it, just like I did with my palette, and then I can use that same color again. Right? So that's a benefit of using a palette. It's easier to control how much water and how much pigment you're adding to it. And so like this is probably the best way to mix colors if you're doing like big paintings, right? So it's mixing that color together in the palette, right? You can store it and use it for later. So let's do that. We've got that for our orange and our green. To make the purple, we'll do the same thing. We'll just kind of follow that through. So we're going to get water on our brush, do about a few drops of water there. We're going to start with that red, right? Getting the red on our brush so we have some nice pigment there. Scrape it. 1. So we get that color off the brush. We're going to clean our brush. Make sure we don't have any pigment transfer, right? And then we're going to get some blue. I'm going to go to my true blue here. So I've got that little blue on my brush. And then come over here. 2, 3. We'll clean our brush. All right, and then we'll mix that together. Once we've tapped our brush dry, we can do that mixing, right? So we're getting that in-between color. So we've got this shade of purple here, right? So that's one way to mix colors, by doing it in the palette like this. Another way to mix color is to mix on the paper. This is nice because you don't have to have a whole bunch of mixed colors on palettes, right? It's right here, you can use that. It's a little harder to control the amount of color you're putting to mix together. But it is a helpful way to mix color too. So let's say I want to mix my red and orange to create that red-orange color. So what I'm going to do, if I'm mixing on my palette here, what I'm going to do is take my brush. I'm going to come over here for the orange that's mixed and just make a mark here. So I've got my in-between color. Right? Clean my brush, tap it, and then I'm going to get some of that red. So I don't want a whole lot. So I want just a little bit because I want to try and make equal parts. And again, it's harder to do the equal parts with this type of mixing, but it's helpful when you're doing some paintings, right? Trying to mix colors. So I'm going to get a little bit of my red on my brush, just a little bit, and just kind of mix it on the palette there. So you can see that that red, I need a little more water here. Add a little bit more of this red. Okay. Clean that. And then add a little more of the yellow, or I mean the orange, right? So we're getting by doing equal parts. So I did 2 parts orange to 2 parts red, and I got that in between orange and red, my red orange, right? So that's mixing it on the palette. Like I said, it's a little harder to mix when you're doing something like this, making exact colors. But when you're in the middle of a painting, sometimes, like if we're painting flowers and you want to kind of get the color change in that flower, this is a good way to do that. Yeah. So mixing on the palette. Again, for the yellow and orange, I'll start off with my lightest color again, taking that orange or that yellow, making that mark, cleaning my brush, mm, and then coming over to, excuse me, that green or that yellow and orange. So I'm going to go add some of that orange. Take my brush, dip it in that orange, and just kind of mix. Oh, I meant to mix it. There we go. So you've got that yellow orange. You've got your your yellow orange, which is in between that yellow and orange, right? So as we're kind of going through, you can see how those different ways of mixing can kind of change that color, right? Another way to mix is by doing layers, right? And we'll talk more about this during techniques, but when we go over techniques. But to do layers with these two, like I want to do a yellow green color. So what I'm going to do is start off by mixing a yellow and doing a layer of that. I want to let that dry before I add my green on top of it. And what this is called is glazing. So it's about layering those colors on top of each other, right? So now we're kind of practicing that color wheel. Let's wait for that to dry just a little bit, and then we'll add that color on top of it. But I definitely want to encourage practicing mixing those colors. Again, the first way to mix is in a palette, right? So mixing your colors on a palette. The second way to mix colors is to mix directly on your paper, mixing those colors together. And the third way to mix colors is on by glazing, by layering them up. So what I'm going to do is take my yellow is mostly dry, and so I'll take my green and just kind of do a layer on top. And so that gives me a layer on top of a layer. So I'm getting those colors through. Because watercolor is very translucent, you do a lot of layering. And we'll see that when we actually start doing the painting itself. Like when we're creating a landscape, you'll be able to see those different layers that we add to it. To get a darker color, you do layers. To get good transitions, you do layers. So it's helpful to kind of practice those different techniques too. So I definitely want to encourage kind of following that color wheel around. Mix green with blue. Start with that green, right? Lay that down, add that blue to it. We want to start with that lighter color. When you're mixing that purple and blue, you'll start with that lighter purple, mix that blue. Same thing all the way around. Now, I mentioned before about how when you think about complementary colors, it helps us with some natural shading, right? So I'm going to talk about an apple right now. Where's my pencil? So if you have a pencil and you want to try it out, definitely pull that pencil out. I'm going to use a pen so it's a little easier to see on camera. But let's say that I'm going to draw an apple really quickly. So this is my basic apple. Right? If I want a natural shadow for my apple, my red apple, I want to think about the complementary color. So I know my complementary color of red is opposite it on the color wheel. So that means green. Right? So what I want to do is take my green, and I'm going to come over here to my pan palette here. I'm going to dip my brush in water, give it a little tappy tap, take my green, get it on my brush, and then I want to come here and think about where my shadow is. So if I'm thinking about shadow for my apple, I'm going to start off by thinking the light is over here, right? So if the light is hitting it here, that means the shadow is going to be on the opposite side, right? So I'm going to take my green and just add a little bit here. Right? I'm not doing a whole lot, just going to add a little bit. Right? I'm going to let that dry just a tiny bit, not completely dry. And I'm also going to come over here and talk about doing it the opposite way. So we're starting with green to create that natural shadow for my red apple. If I want to do a leaf, let's say I've got a couple leaves here that I want green leaves. I'm going to think about my natural shadow, right? My complementary color of green, that's what I want, my green leaf. That complementary color is opposite on the color wheel, so that means red. So what I'm going to do is get my brush and get a tiny bit of my red pigment, right? And then come over to my leaf and think about where that natural shadow is, right? So if I'm thinking the same way, the light is coming from this side, so my shadows are going to be here. I'm going to kind of think about adding that little bit of red for my natural shadow, right? So we're using just those two colors. That red apple, the complementary color is green. So I'm going to use that green as my natural shadow. For green leaf, that green, that complementary color is red. So I'm going to use that red as a natural shadow. Right? We've got this drying just a tiny bit, not super wet. And this is something we'll kind of learn the more we do some painting, right? But just to talk about blending and mixing those colors, I'm going to take my brush, wet it, come over to my red, get some red on my brush. I'm going to start to fill in my red apple, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect here. We're just kind of blending in that red, right? And so when we get to the green, we're just going to kind of blend that in, right? I'm going to add some more red, thinking about the darker shades of red and blending it into that shadow, right? Those natural colors. So I'm doing some color mixing here and creating that kind of natural shadow, right? So we're thinking about the light hitting here. This is where there's less light, right? So we've got that natural shadow. The same is true with our green leaves. So I'm going to come over to my green. I think I use this green. Get my brush wet, tap it in my pigment here, and then come over to my leaf and do the same. Start with that thick green, right? The plain green color, and then just kind of blend it into that red, right? So what that's doing is giving us that kind of natural shadow. Yeah. And this takes some time to kind of practice with, right? That blending and mixing, but it's just kind of a basic, right? Blending and mixing. So we can see that natural shadow start to come. And like I said, this is one of many ways to get a natural shadow, but that's where it's helpful to know our complementary colors, because we can blend and mix to create that natural shadow. If same thing is true if we're doing a lemon. Let's say we want to do, I'm just going to do a lemon here. Right? If I'm thinking about creating a lemon, my lemon is yellow. That complementary color of yellow is going to be that purple. So what I want to do is get a clean brush, right? Get some of my purple here and think about where that shadow is, right? Adding that shadow. Cleaning my brush and then tapping it in the clean water, going to my yellow, and then just start painting, right? We see what that's doing. So mixing those complementary colors gives us this really nice shade of brown, which is kind of that natural shadow, right? We can be like more detailed with it. This, of course, is just a really quick painting of it, but hopefully you can see that thinking about those complementary colors can help us draw in a more natural paint in a more natural way too. I think a lot of times when we think about shadow or shading, we think about bringing black in, and there's good, there's nothing wrong with that. But if we want to think about natural shadows, it helps to think about those complementary colors because it'll start to look more natural. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions that are coming up. I know we kind of started a lot of conversation here about creating those color swatches, talking about a color wheel and talking about natural shadows. But are there questions that are coming up right now about any of these things? And I know you see, I'm not completely finished with mine. I definitely want to encourage, if you're not finished with yours, definitely continue that on. I'll be doing that with mine too. But are there some questions that are coming up right now?
We have someone asked a while ago, how often should you change your brush rinsing water?
Ooh, that's a good question too. So if we look at my water here, you can see that it's already pretty dark. Once it starts getting dark and you're noticing that when you clean it and go to tap it on your rag or your paper towel, that there's color on it, no matter how many times you can swish it and touch it, that's a good indicator that we need to change that water. You won't have to do it super often, but I do it like I would change the water now to continue painting. Once it starts getting really muddy, that's a good time to go ahead and change it out. That's a really good question.
Awesome. And then is that safe to dump that dirty water down your drain?
Yeah, so you can do that. That's pretty easy to kind of just pour it down the drain. This is liquid, so it's not you're not sending like clumps of things down. So that's totally okay. Some of the things, some of the different pigments that you get are kind of hazardous, like so definitely don't put those down the drain. But for most of like the watercolor pigments, you can dump that down the drain. I will say when it comes to getting a container of water, you don't need to fill that container up all the way to clean your brush. You see mine, this is a little container here, a little cup, and I'm only about 1/2 inch of water in it. So there's not a lot of water in there. So I'm not pouring a whole bunch of water down there. Good question. I see we've got a couple hands up. Marjorie, you have a question or comment?
I'm a little behind when it came to mixing of the colors. When you were
Yeah.
doing the wheel,
Mm-hmm.
got a little turned around when you were mixing the colors to produce purple.
Yeah.
I believe I had like a million little things in water, brushes and whatever.
Yeah.
So can you just tell me it was
Oh, sure.
yellow? Was it yellow and red? Was it? I'm not
Yeah, so
sure.
to make purple, if we think about our color wheel, I'm going to come back to my color
Yeah,
wheel.
I
If
was
we think about mixing colors, we have our
okay,
primary colors here,
right.
that red, yellow, and blue.
Ooh,
Those
uh-huh.
secondary colors are made from mixing two primary colors. So the
Okay.
secondary color purple is going to be
Uh-huh.
made from mixing the blue and the
Mhm.
red, right? Because that's going to be in between in our color wheel. It's in
Okay.
between those two colors. And so those are the
Mhm.
two colors we'll mix. If we're thinking
Okay.
about the two primary colors in our color wheel, the yellow and blue,
Uh-huh.
we're going to mix those two to create that green.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And then, of course, you can mix those colors in your palette or
Mm-hmm.
on your paper or by layering them like I did with the yellow and the green. So there are a
Mm-hmm.
couple ways to mix it.
Okay.
Yeah, good
All
question.
right. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I was trying to do too many things at once.
Yeah, I know that feeling for sure. Bridget, I see you've got your hand up too. You have a question or comment you'd like to add?
Did you say Bridget?
Bridget, yes, ma'am.
Okay, okay. I'm not sure if I totally, let me just say this class is wonderful, but I'm not sure if I totally understand, because you started talking about when you were doing the shadows, you started talking about, for example, using a darker red, then you said complementary colors. So I'm not really sure how the shadowing, how the complementary versus the darker color fits with shadowing.
Yeah, so when I was talking about the darker colors, I was just adding red to my already painted red. It looks darker when you're adding another layer. So I did my layer of red, and then I went back with that same layer, that same red, and it made it a little darker on my paper. But when we talk about making that natural shadow, we're mixing those complementary colors together. So using that red and that green will give you that natural shadow. Okay.
Okay, okay, thank you.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. And then Lena, I see you've got your hand up next. Do you have a question or comment?
Hi, was that Lane that you were asking?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
great. Hi. So I purchased these little tubes
Mm-hmm.
of paint as opposed to a palette like what you've shown.
Mm-hmm.
How do we do the color activation with that? How would what you taught us
Oh,
vary
oh,
based
great
on
question.
tubes?
So I already have, for my palette here, I already have the colors on there. But if you are adding like the tube straight from the tube, it's already going to be a little wet, so you won't need to spray it with the water. Once
Ah,
it dries is when we need to activate it. So the
Oh.
first time you use that pigment right out of the tube, you won't need to activate it because it's coming straight from that tube. But once it dries, you'll want to activate it by spraying the water. I will say, once you use this palette, like my colors are activated, they're wet. I want to wait till they're dry before I close my palette up again.
Okay.
Because if it's still wet and I close my palette, whether I've got the paint palette or my tray, those colors will blend and mix. And so we don't want that. We want to kind of keep them separate so we have those basic colors.
Okay. And you
Good
know how
question.
you had us put some just plain water in
Mhm.
your palette? Should we still do that before we mix what comes from the tube?
Yes. So that helps because not only does it thin it out, but it gives kind of like that mixing medium for mixing those colors together. So even when they're already wet, they're straight from the tube, they're already activated, so you won't need to spray it again. But to do that mixing and blending, you'll add that little bit of water before you add those colors in.
Okay, great. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am. And then I know we've got some questions in the chat too. We just got like 1 minute left. But I do want to say thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have questions still, definitely come next week and we'll try to get to all of them. I'll stop a little more in advance. But I do want to say homework is not something that I like. But watercolor is a practice that needs to be nurtured. And so the more you play around with mixing and blending those colors and testing them out, the more confident you'll feel in that mark making and mixing. So I definitely want to say if you have some time this week, maybe like 5 minutes or just a few minutes to kind of mix those colors and play around with some of the things that we talked about today, then that's going to be good practice. So when we start talking about those techniques, some of this stuff will feel kind of natural. And again, like getting into that habit of like cleaning your brush with one, tapping it, adding water, and then going to your pigment, just kind of creating that habit will help in the long run for sure. So next week, we'll kind of recap this just a little bit and then start going into techniques. So definitely bring your paints next week too. And I'll turn it over to Nicole. I'm sorry I talked so much.
Don't apologize. This was fantastic. So thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you next week. Same day, same time. Bye, everyone.